Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle tale from the heart of England's green and pleasant land. Pour yourself a cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and allow Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead to guide you through a puzzle wrapped in frost and friendship. You are about to hear Miss Marple and the frozen truth uncovered. 10 chapters await, each is marked with a timestamp so you may pause and return at your leisure. Chapter 1, The Icicle That Fell. Snow lay thick upon St. Mary Mead that January of 1952, a relentless blanket that had descended upon the village like a mischievous aunt, smothering sounds and softening edges until the world seemed wrapped in cotton wool. The church bell, usually a clarion call to matins or evensong, tolled muffled and distant, as if even it had caught a chill and preferred to whisper rather than proclaim. The high street, that familiar ribbon of cobblestones and gossip, had been transmuted into a pristine path of white velvet where the footprints of early risers, milkmen with their clinking bottles, the postman on his bicycle with its protesting chain, vanished almost as quickly as they formed, swallowed by fresh flurries that danced from a sky the color of tarnished silver. At the far end of this enchanted thoroughfare stood Dane Mead Manor, a rambling edifice that bore the scars of time like a proud old soldier. Half Tudor with its diamond-paned windows and crooked chimney pots, half Victorian in its added turrets and bay windows that protruded like afterthoughts. The manor had been in the Harrington family since the days when Queen Victoria still held court, and its gardens, now slumbering under the snow, had once bloomed with roses that perfumed the air during village fetes. Smoke curled lazily from its chimneys, pale plumes against the iron-gray heavens, carrying the faint comforting scent of coal fires and baking bread to those hardy souls who braved the cold. It was to this manor that Miss Jane Marple made her way that fateful Tuesday morning, her steps measured and unhurried, as befitted a lady of 70-odd years who had long since learned that haste was the enemy of observation. She was bundled against the bite of the wind in a bottle-green wool coat, its hem brushing the tops of her sensible laced boots, which left neat, purposeful prints in the snow. A woolen scarf, knitted in an intricate cable pattern by her own hands during many a quiet evening, was wound twice about her neck, and atop her silvered hair sat a felt hat of the same practical green, adorned only by a single pheasant feather that nodded gently with each step. In her gloved hand, she carried a slim volume borrowed from the village library, a treatise on English wildflowers by no less an authority than Mr. Gilbert White, and her basket slung over one arm held a jar of her own gooseberry jam, a gift for her old friend Colonel Bantry, whose gout had kept him indoors these past weeks. Miss Marple paused at the wrought-iron gates of Mead, which stood slightly ajar as if in perpetual welcome, their fleur-de-lis finials dusted with frost like sugared pastries. She had intended to return the book and inquire after the Colonel's health, perhaps share a cup of tea in the morning room where the fire always burned brightly and Mrs. Bantry presided over her embroidery with cheerful inefficiency. But as she lifted the latch with a soft creak that echoed unnaturally in the still air, her sharp eyes, blue as faded cornflowers yet keen as a hawk's, were drawn upward to the overhanging eaves of the manor house. There, suspended like a crystalline sword from the guttering, hung a procession of icicles, each one a marvel of nature's artistry. Translucent shafts that caught the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds and refracted it into fleeting rainbows. They varied in length and girth, some as slender as a lady's finger, others as thick as a man's thumb, their surfaces etched with delicate patterns where the melt had refrozen in the night. It was the largest of these directly above the library window, a dagger of ice some 18 inches long, perfectly straight and tapering to a needlepoint. That commanded her attention. For it was no longer hanging. It had fallen or been dislodged, and now lay embedded in the snowdrift below, its shaft buried to the hilt in the pristine white, as if plunged there by some invisible hand. Around its base, the snow was discolored not with the clean melt of mere water, but with a deeper, more sinister hue. A single drop of crimson, bright as holly berries against the snow, had welled up from the point of impact and now trembled on the tip of the icicle's emergent point, poised as if in indecision before freezing solid in the sub-zero air. The drop was small, no larger than a tear, but unmistakable. A bead of blood that spoke of violence in this place of quiet gentility. Curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her voice a soft thread in the tapestry of silence. She adjusted her spectacles, perched on the bridge of her nose like a benign sentinel, and leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene with her own footprints. Icicles did not usually bleed, she reflected. They wept clear tears of meltwater, or shattered into harmless shards upon the ground. This one had pierced something vital, something warm and pulsing before coming to rest. And the library window above, its heavy velvet curtains half drawn, a sliver of interior warmth escaping through the gap, seemed to gaze down at her with an air of mild reproach, as if to say, "What have you stumbled upon now, my dear?" The peace of the moment was shattered by a sudden clamor from within the manor. Raised voices, sharp as breaking glass, mingled with the thud of hurried footsteps and a cry that was half sob, half exclamation. The front door, a sturdy oak portal banded with iron and flanked by stone urns now overflowing with snow, burst open with a bang that sent a cascade of powder from the lintel. Framed in the doorway stood Grimsby, the Harringtons' butler of some 30 years' service, a man whose dignity was as starched as his collar and whose face, usually as impassive as a Roman bust, was now drained of color. His thin lips parted in uncharacteristic alarm. He clutched the doorframe with one hand, his other gesturing wildly toward the side of the house where the library lay. Snowflakes caught in his sparse gray hair, melting into rivulets that traced paths down his furrowed brow. "Miss Marple," he gasped, his voice cracking like thin ice underfoot. "Thank heavens you've come. It's Sir Giles. He's dead. Stabbed clean through the heart with that thing." His trembling finger pointed accusingly at the fallen icicle, now transformed from natural wonder to instrument of fate, its crimson tip glinting accusingly in the pale light. Grimsby's eyes, magnified behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, darted from the frozen dagger to Miss Marple's serene countenance, as if seeking in her the anchor he so desperately needed. "I was in the scullery polishing the silver for luncheon when I heard the most frightful thud, like a branch snapping in a gale, rushed out, and there it was in him. Oh, merciful heavens!" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm, her touch as light as a falling leaf, yet steadying him at once. "Compose yourself, Grimsby," she said softly, her tone that of a favorite aunt soothing a fretful child. "Take a deep breath of this fine, crisp air. Now tell me, where precisely is Sir Giles?" "In the library, miss. Slumped over his desk like he'd nodded off with a book. But the blood, it's everywhere, soaking his shirt front, pooling on the carpet, and the French windows ajar, frost creeping in like an uninvited guest. Lady Honoria found him not 5 minutes ago. She's in hysterics, calling for salts and the doctor all at once." Grimsby's voice steadied somewhat under her influence, though his hands still twisted the hem of his apron as if wringing out the shock. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning like the pages of an open book, cataloging details. The position of the icicle, the state of the window, the timing implied by Grimsby's routine. Sir Giles Harrington had been a fixture of St. Mary Mead for as long as she could recall. A bluff, hardy man in his late 50s with a ruddy complexion from years of hunting and a laugh that boomed through the church porch on Sundays. A retired colonial administrator, he had returned from India with tales of tigers and monsoons and a fortune in tea plantations that kept Mead in fine fettle. Widowed these 5 years past? No. Lady Honoria was his second wife, a handsome woman of imperious bearing who had swept into the village like a clipper ship, all silks and sharp wit. Theirs was not the happiest of unions, whispered the tongues at the post office, but murder? That was a leap even the most scandal-hungry could scarce credit. Come then, Miss Marple said, stepping past him into the warmth of the entrance hall, where the air was thick with the scents of beeswax polish and wood smoke. Lead me to him, but mind the prints in the snow outside. No one is to trample the evidence until we've had a proper look. She handed Grimsby her basket and book with a small smile. And perhaps a pot of tea for Lady Honoria? Strong with 2 sugars. It does wonders for the nerves. Grimsby bobbed his head, gratitude flooding his features, and scurried off toward the kitchens, his footsteps echoing on the black and white tiled floor. Miss Marple proceeded alone down the corridor, her boots leaving faint damp marks that she noted with a pursing of lips. Another detail, another thread in the emerging tapestry. The library door stood open, a portal of dark mahogany inlaid with brass, and from within came the low murmur of voices. Lady Honoria's high and quavering, interspersed with the deeper rumble of Dr. Hayden Lloyd, the village physician, whose calm was as renowned as his bedside manner. Miss Marple paused on the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light within. The library was a room of comfortable grandeur, its walls lined floor to ceiling with oak shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes. Gibbon's Decline and Fall, Scott's Waverley novels, and row upon row of military histories that spoke to Sir Giles's passions. A turkey carpet in muted reds and blues muffled her steps, and at the room's heart stood a massive partner's desk of polished mahogany, its surface cluttered with the detritus of a morning's work, an open ledger, a silver letter opener shaped like a Bengal tiger, a half-smoked cigar smoldering in an ashtray of green malachite. Persian rugs were strewn about like the hides of vanquished foes, and a fire crackled merrily in the grate, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls like secretive sprites. But it was the figure slumped across the desk that drew the eye inexorably, as a moth to flame. Sir Giles Harrington lay forward on his elbows, his head bowed as if in profound contemplation of some abstruse problem. His graying hair tousled, his wire-framed reading glasses askew on his nose. He wore a tweed jacket of heather hue, waistcoat unbuttoned at the collar, and a starched white shirt that was now marred by a terrible bloom of red, a stain that spread from the center of his chest like an ink blot in reverse, dark and viscous, seeping into the fabric and dripping in lazy rivulets onto the open pages of his ledger below. His right hand still clutched a fountain pen, its nib poised over a half-formed signature, and his left lay limp, palm upturned as if in surrender. The wound itself was hidden by the folds of his shirt, but the icicle, retrieved by some well-meaning soul and now laid like an accusation upon the desk's edge, told the tale. Its point was smeared with the same crimson, and a faint trail of red flecks marked its path from the French windows where it must have fallen across the carpet to its final resting place. Lady Honoria Harrington knelt beside him, her elegant figure clad in a house dress of dove-gray silk, now rumpled and stained at the knee from her prostration. She was a woman of striking presence, even in distress. Tall and slender, with hair the color of polished chestnuts drawn into a chignon, and features that might have been carved by a Renaissance master. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes of stormy gray that now brimmed with tears unshed, more from shock than sorrow, one suspected. Her hands fluttered like distressed birds, one pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips, the other clutching the back of a leather armchair for support. "Oh, Jane," Miss Marple, she gasped as she caught sight of the newcomer rising unsteadily to her feet. It's too dreadful. I came to ask Giles about the invitations for the hunt ball, and there he was, like this. The thud. I heard it from the morning room, thought it was a fallen branch. Rushed in and the blood everywhere. Who could have done such a thing? In broad daylight, in our own home. Her voice rose to a wail, but there was steel beneath it, the timbre of one accustomed to command. Dr. Lloyd, a compact man in his early 40s with a neatly trimmed mustache and the air of quiet authority that came from delivering countless village babes and binding innumerable sprains, straightened from his crouch beside the body. He adjusted his stethoscope, dangling like a talisman about his neck, and wiped his hands on a square of linen from his black bag, which stood open on the floor amid scattered instruments. Syringes, bandages, a bottle of digitalis. His face was pale but composed, the scent of carbolic soap clinging to him like a second skin. "I'm afraid it's quite hopeless, Lady Honoria," he said gravely, his Welsh lilt softening the words. "Death instantaneous, I'd wager. Single puncture wound straight to the heart, clean as a surgeon's incision. Time of death around 11 o'clock, give or take. But this," he gestured to the icicle with a shake of his head, "an act of God or the devil's own mischief. The thing pierced him like an arrow, drove the air from his lungs before he could cry out." Miss Marple moved forward with the deliberation of one who knows the value of first impressions, her gaze sweeping the room in a comprehensive arc. The French windows ajar by a hand's breadth, admitting a breath of frigid air that had begun to feather the inner sill with filigree frost. The curtains, heavy brocade and hunting scenes stirring faintly in the draught. The hearthrug undisturbed save for a single boot print near the fender, too large for a woman's. The desk itself where papers lay scattered but not ransacked, as if interrupted mid-thought rather than in malice. She bent slightly, careful of her back, which had been giving twinges since Michaelmas, and examined the icicle more closely. Its surface was slick, not yet fully thawed, and embedded in its translucent length were tiny air bubbles, like secrets trapped in amber. The point was indeed sharp, honed by drip after drip of melt in the night, capable of penetrating cloth and flesh with ease. But the angle was telling. It had fallen vertically, true, but the wound's position suggested a slight arc, as if guided rather than purely gravitational. "Precision is a curious word for chance, Doctor," Miss Marple observed mildly, straightening with a small sigh and meeting his eyes with that disarming blend of innocence and acuity that had confounded many a sharper mind. "Icicles fall erratically, do they not? Haphazard as boys tossing snowballs. Yet this one struck true as if aimed by a steady hand. And the blood in the snow outside, only a drop, you say? Remarkable for such a mortal thrust." She turned to Lady Honoria, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "My dear, you must sit down. Grimsby will bring tea anon. Now pray, when did you last see Sir Giles alive?" Lady Honoria collapsed into the armchair, her skirts pooling like spilled mercury, and accepted a glass of water from the doctor with trembling fingers. "At breakfast, 8:30. He was in fine spirits, talking of the estate accounts and that wretched nephew of his, Roger, always importuning for money. Said he'd be in the library all morning, no interruptions. I thought nothing of it until that sound." She dabbed at her eyes, though they remained dry. The servants were about their duties, Mrs. Price in the kitchen, Daphne typing in the study next door. No one near enough to witness. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the names. Daphne Mead, the young secretary with the typing fingers and the tragic past. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper whose loyalty was as deep as her silences. Roger Blaine, the captain, sun-bronzed and restless, forever on the fringes of fortune. Threads, all of them, to be tugged later. Aloud, she said only, "One always notices the unusual in the midst of the ordinary, does one not? Like a wool thread caught on a thorn in summer or a footprint that leads nowhere." The sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, the young detective from Much Benham, who burst into the room moments later, stamping snow from his Wellington boots and unwinding a damp woolen muffler. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by outdoor duties and eyes that missed little, though perhaps not the subtleties that Miss Marple savored. Lady Honoria, Doctor, heard the news from the switchboard. What the deuce happened here? He glanced at the body, then the icicle, his brows knitting into a thundercloud. Blimey, natural accident most likely. Icicle formed overnight, grew heavy with the thaw, snapped off at precisely the wrong moment. These old houses, eh? Eaves like that, death traps in winter. Tragic, but no. Call for alarm. I'll need statements, of course, but I dare say it's straightforward. He pulled out a notebook, pencil poised, exuding the bluff confidence of officialdom. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the machinery of justice to grind into motion. Miss Marple's knitting needles, retrieved from her coat pocket, a simple pair of bamboo ever at hand, clicked softly as she settled into a wing chair by the fire, her gaze drifting to the window where the snow continued to fall, veiling the world in white. Straightforward, perhaps, but she had seen too many accidents in her quiet village life. Poisonings disguised as indigestion, falls that were pushes, quarrels that ended in silence, to credit coincidence without question. The icicle lay there on the desk, innocent as a church spire, yet whispering of human intent. And in St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed like snowdrops in spring, the truth was rarely as frozen as it first appeared. As Grimsby returned with a laden tray, tea service of spode china, scones still warm from the oven, and a decanter of brandy for medicinal purposes, Miss Marple accepted her cup with a nod of thanks. The steam rose in fragrant curls, carrying notes of Darjeeling and a hint of bergamot, a small comfort amid the chill that had settled not just in the room but in the marrow of the morning. She sipped, her mind weaving the first fragile web of inquiry. Who had cause to wish Sir Giles harm? What hand had perhaps nudged that fateful spear of ice? And why in this cozy corner of England had winter turned so treacherously sharp? The chapter's end found her thus, knitting in hand, listening as Craddock took down particulars, her thoughts as intricate and unyielding as the pattern growing beneath her fingers. The mystery had only just begun to unfold, petal by frozen petal. Chapter 2. 5 Faces at the Funeral. The churchyard of St. Mary Mead lay hushed beneath a pewter sky, the snow so deep that the verger had been obliged to shovel a narrow black path between the lych gate and the west door. Even the ancient yew trees, those silent guardians of centuries of village sorrow, wore mantles of white thick enough to bend their dark branches almost to the ground. The bell tolled 9 slow strokes, each one muffled by the cold as though the bronze itself were reluctant to disturb the stillness. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her custom, her small figure almost swallowed by the fur collar of her best black coat, sable though no one in the village would have dreamed of asking its provenance. She carried no flowers. Instead, in her gloved hands, she held a single sprig of winter jasmine, its yellow stars bright against the gloom. She laid it gently on the pile of wreaths already heaped beside the open grave and stepped back, her cornflower blue eyes moving across the gathering mourners with the quiet precision of a naturalist observing birds at a feeder. They came, as they always did in St. Mary Mead, because death was a communal affair, and Sir Giles Harrington had been one of their own. Yet 5 faces among the 30-odd black-clad figures stood apart, drawn together by something stronger than mere neighborly duty. Miss Marple noted them the way a knitter notes the first dropped stitch. Quietly, calmly, and with absolute certainty that it would matter later. First, closest to the graveside, stood Lady Honoria Harrington, widow of 74 hours. Tall even in grief, she wore mourning as though it had been designed for her alone. A coat of finest black cashmere with a collar of Russian sable, a veiled hat tilted at precisely the angle that revealed the perfect oval of her cheek. Diamonds winked at her ears and throat, for Honoria had always believed that deep mourning need not be dowdy. Her gloved hand rested on the arm of Captain Roger Blaine, Sir Giles's nephew, and until yesterday, heir presumptive. Roger's sunburn had faded to an unbecoming parchment yellow beneath the English winter, and his eyes, restless, sea-green, forever calculating tides, kept sliding toward the solicitor, Mr. Sims, who hovered at the edge of the crowd clutching a buff envelope as though it might explode. To Honoria's left, half a pace behind as befitted her station, stood Miss Daphne Mead, Sir Giles's secretary. 25 years old, pale as the snow itself, Daphne wore a coat of navy wool that had seen better days, and a black velvet beret pulled low over her ash-blonde curls. Her eyes were red-rimmed, yet Miss Marple noticed that the tears had dried some minutes ago. Now the girl stared at the coffin with an expression that was less sorrow than calculation, as though she were adding up columns of figures that refused to balance. In her pocket something crackled, paper thick and official, when she shifted her weight. Dr. Hayden Lloyd, the village physician, stood a little apart, his black overcoat unbuttoned despite the cold, revealing the inevitable wool waistcoat and the gold watch chain that had belonged to his father. His face was calm, almost austere, but his fingers drummed a silent tattoo against his thigh. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse. Miss Marple filed the rhythm away. Hayden had served in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and old habits died hard. Last of the 5, half hidden beneath the U-arch, was Mrs. Price, housekeeper at Danemead for 43 years. She wore the same black bombazine she had worn to Sir Giles's first wife's funeral, the same jet brooch, the same expression of tightly corseted grief. Only her hands betrayed her. They worried at a handkerchief until the lace edging began to fray, and every so often her gaze darted toward Lady Honoria with something that might have been hatred or fear or both. The vicar, dear Mr. Clement, whose sermons were mercifully short, began the committal. His voice floated out over the snow like incense. "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord." Miss Marple did not mouth the responses. She was watching Roger Blaine. When the coffin began its slow descent, creaking ropes, the smell of wet earth rising sharp and loamy, Roger's jaw tightened, and his fingers closed convulsively on Honoria's arm. Honoria did not flinch. Instead, she leaned almost imperceptibly into the pressure, as though drawing strength from the very man who might have wished her husband dead. At the graveside's edge, Daphne Mead swayed. Dr. Lloyd moved with the swift grace of a man who had caught fainting women in village halls and hospital corridors alike. He took her elbow, murmuring something too low for anyone else to hear. Daphne's lips shaped a single word. Miss Marple was almost sure it was no, before she allowed herself to be led away toward the lich gate. Mrs. Price remained until the last sod fell. Only then did she cross herself, though she was Church of England to the backbone, and turn away, her boots crunching a solitary path through the snow. Afterward, in the parish hall, the village gathered as it always did, ostensibly for tea and ham sandwiches, in truth for the ancient ritual of sorting gossip into fact and fancy. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea the color of mahogany from Mrs. Bantry, who was presiding over the urn with the enthusiasm of a general directing artillery. "Well, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial hiss she believed was a whisper, "what do you make of it?" "Poor Giles, speared like a kipper by an icicle. I always said those eaves were dangerous." Remember when old Mr. Cargill lost his eye to a slate in '39? Miss Marple sipped. The tea was stewed, but one did not complain at funerals. Slates fall outward, Dolly. Icicles fall downward. There is a difference. Across the room, Lady Honoria held court beside the radiator, diamonds flashing as she gestured. A small circle had formed. The Colonel, Mr. Sims the solicitor, and young Lucy Islesbarrow, who had come home from her secretarial job in London for the occasion and was clearly relishing the drama. "They say he changed his will last week," Lucy announced, loud enough for half the hall to hear. "Left everything to a home for indigent cats. Honoria will be lucky to get the silver fish slice." Honoria's laugh rang out, bright and brittle. "My dear Lucy, Giles adored cats, but he adored me more. Mr. Sims, perhaps you would be good enough to enlighten the vultures?" The solicitor cleared his throat, adjusting pince-nez that trembled with importance. "Lady Harrington is quite correct. The will, executed on the 5th of January, leaves the estate, house, investments, the tea plantations in Assam, entirely to her, with the exception of a legacy of £5,000 to Miss Daphne Mead for faithful service, and a similar sum to Mrs. Price. Captain Blaine receives nothing." A collective intake of breath rippled through the hall like wind, across wheat. Roger Blaine, who had been leaning against the wall nursing a whiskey someone had pressed upon him, straightened as though shot. "Nothing?" His voice cracked on the word. "After all, after everything?" He strode across the room, boots leaving wet prints on the parquet. "Uncle Giles promised me—" "Promises," Honoria cut in smooth as silk, "are not legal documents, Roger dear. And you did borrow rather a lot against expectations, did you not? 20,000, was it, or 25? Roger's face flushed the color of uncooked liver. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might strike her. Instead, he spun on his heel and shouldered his way out into the snow, slamming the door so hard that the tea urn rattled. In the hush that followed, Daphne Mead slipped quietly from the hall. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her own boots silent on the packed path. Outside, the snow had ceased, leaving the world blindingly bright. Daphne stood beneath the yew tree where the wreaths were piled, staring at a small posy of forced violets tied with black ribbon. As Miss Marple watched, the girl drew from her pocket the paper that had crackled earlier, a letter, thick cream stock, the Mead crest embossed in silver. She held it a moment, then, with a gesture that was almost violent, thrust it into the heart of the violets and pressed snow over it, burying it deep. Only then did she see Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't—" Her voice trembled. "I just needed air." "Of course, my dear." Miss Marple's tone was kindness itself. "Funerals are trying, especially when one has been close to the deceased." Daphne flushed scarlet. "It wasn't like that. Sir Giles was my employer, nothing more." Yet her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held the desperate brilliance of a cornered animal. Back in the hall, Dr. Lloyd was helping Mrs. Price into her coat. The housekeeper's hands shook so badly that he had to fasten the buttons for her. "Thank you, doctor," she whispered. 43 years I gave that house. 43, and now strangers will walk its corridors." "Not strangers, Mrs. Price," Lloyd said gently. "Lady Honoria has been mistress these 10 years. "Mistress?" Mrs. Price's laugh was bitter as aloes. "She was never that. Not in the way Miss Eleanor was. Sir Giles' first wife, now there was a real lady. This one—" She pressed her lips together, realizing she had said too much. Miss Marple, returning unnoticed, caught the tail of the conversation. She filed it away with the rest: the buried letter, Roger's rage, Honoria's diamonds, Lloyd's Morse code fingers, Mrs. Price's 43 years of unspoken resentment. As the hall emptied, the verger began stacking chairs. Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to help Mrs. Bantry with the cups, in truth to watch the 5 mourners disperse like dark petals on the wind. Honoria regal and untouchable, driven away in the Bentley by Grimsby. Roger striding toward the Red Lion where whiskey waited. Daphne hurrying toward the bus stop, coat collar turned up against more than cold. Dr. Lloyd pausing to light a cigarette beneath the lich gate, the match flaring briefly on his unreadable face. Mrs. Price trudging alone toward Don Mead, her footprints the only ones that did not falter. Miss Marple gathered her basket, adjusted her hat, and stepped out into the dazzling afternoon. The snow was already crusting over, forming a hard shell that would bear a person's weight if they walked carefully. 5 faces, 5 motives, 5 sets of footprints leading away from a grave. And somewhere beneath the violets, or in a drawer, or locked in a heart, the first real clue lay waiting for someone gentle enough and ruthless enough to find it. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small, private smile that had nothing to do with mirth. "Poor Sir Giles," she murmured to the empty churchyard. "You always did keep uncomfortable company. Let us see which of them was uncomfortable enough to kill you." Chapter 3, Footprints in the Snow. The morning after the funeral dawned so bright that the snow threw back a glare sharp enough to make the eyes water. Miss Marple, who had slept indifferently, dreams of icicles dripping red, rose at 7, drank a cup of weak tea, and did something she had not done since the war. She telephoned Colonel Bantry and asked to borrow his spaniel. Bingo arrived at 8:30, a black and white tornado of tail and tongue, dragging the gardener's boy on the end of a lead. Miss Marple received him with the gravity due to an official assistant, offered him a digestive biscuit, and set off toward Danemead Manor wrapped in her old covert coat and a determination that made the cold feel irrelevant. The manor gates were shut and padlocked, police orders, but the little postern beside the lodge was not. Miss Marple slipped through, Bingo snuffling eagerly at her heels. The gardens lay virgin under their blanket of snow. No constable had been spared to stand guard in the shrubbery. Perfect. She made first for the library's French windows. The yellow tape Inspector Craddock had strung across them flapped forlornly, already half buried. Beneath the tape, the snow on the terrace had been trampled by official boots, but beyond the balustrade, the rose beds stretched untouched, a vast page of unmarked vellum. Miss Marple studied it the way she studied everything, slowly, kindly, and with devastating attention. 2 sets of prints crossed the rose bed. The first set came from the left, the direction of the kitchen garden. Small, neat, oval-toed, a woman's court shoe, size 5, the sort any lady might wear indoors on a January morning. The prints arrived at the library window, paused directly beneath the sill, then returned the same way. The stride was short, hurried, the heel marks deeper on the outward journey than the inward. Someone, running back, lighter because they had left something behind. The second set began at the far right, where a yew hedge separated the rose garden from the stables. Larger, broader. A man's brogue, hobnailed, the sort Captain Roger Blaine affected. These prints marched straight to the window, stopped. Then, here Miss Marple's breath caught, simply ceased. No return journey. The snow on the sill itself was undisturbed except for a single perfect crescent where the icicle had hung. Bingo, finding the game delightful, plunged into the rosebed and began digging enthusiastically beside a marble sundial. Miss Marple clicked her tongue once. The dog froze, dropped something from his mouth, and sat, tail sweeping snow into a small blizzard. It was a scrap of green wool, hand-knitted, thick, the exact shade of her own winter coat. But not hers. This fragment had been torn, not cut, the yarn ends frayed like a miniature comet tail. Caught on the thorn of a rugosa rose, it had lain hidden beneath yesterday's fresh fall until Bingo's nose unearthed it. Miss Marple tucked the wool into a clean envelope she had brought for the purpose, then allowed Bingo one more circuit. He returned triumphantly with a single brown kid glove, left-handed, monogrammed RB in faded gold thread. Roger Blaine again. She rewarded the dog with the rest of the digestive biscuits and led him home, mind ticking like a well-wound clock. At 11 o'clock, she presented herself at Dame Mead's kitchen door, the front being still sealed, and asked for Mrs. Price. The housekeeper appeared flour to the elbows, eyes redder than yesterday. "May I come in?" Only for a moment. Bingo found something in the rose bed. Mrs. Price's hand flew to her throat. "The police said no one was to—" "The police are not spaniels, my dear." She laid the green wool on the scrub table. Mrs. Price stared as though it were a snake. "That's mine," she whispered, "from the scarf Sir Giles gave me last Christmas. I noticed it missing yesterday morning." "Yesterday?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "But the snow that covered it fell the night before, between midnight and 4. You must have lost it earlier." Mrs. Price's knees gave way. She sat down hard on a Windsor chair. "I couldn't sleep," she said at last. "Not after. At 5:30, I went out to the kitchen garden for parsley. Cook wanted it for the fish. I thought I saw a light in the library. Thought it was her ladyship. Went closer. The French window was open a crack. I peeped through." Her voice dropped to a thread. "Sir Giles was at his desk, head down, just like when we found him. Only he was already still, and Lady Honoria was bending over him, pressing something to his chest. A white cloth, maybe. Then the icicle fell, or seemed to. I ran. I left my scarf caught on the rose. I never told a soul." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You have told me now. That is enough for today." She left Mrs. Price weeping into her apron and walked round to the stables where Captain Blaine's hunter was being exercised by a groom. Roger himself lounged in the yard, lighting a cigarette with fingers that shook. "Miss Marple, come to view the scene of the crime." "I have viewed it, Captain. Your glove was most informative." He glanced down involuntarily at his bare left hand. "Careless of me," he said, attempting a grin that failed. "Dropped it somewhere." "Somewhere beneath the library window at 20 minutes past 11 yesterday morning, yet you told Inspector Craddock you were addressing the ex-serviceman at the village hall from 11:15 sharp." Roger's cigarette snapped between his fingers. "The hall clock is 7 minutes slow," Miss Marple continued mildly. "I timed it myself against the post office. 7 minutes, enough for a man to sprint across the green, enter by the window, and return breathless." Roger opened his mouth, closed it again. In the silence, the hunter whickered, stamping hoofprints into the snow that looked suddenly damningly fresh. Miss Marple turned away. She had tugged 2 threads this morning. Both had begun to unravel. But whose hand held the scissors? As she reached the gate, Bingo barked once, sharp, peremptory. He was staring at the library eaves. High above, where the fatal icicle had hung, a new one was already forming. Longer, thicker, perfect. Someone, somewhere, was making quite certain the weapon could be replaced. Miss Marple tightened her grip on the lead. The game, as Sherlock Holmes once said, was afoot, and the snow was still falling. Chapter 4. The matter of the frozen ink. The library at Dame Mead Manor had been locked since the inquest, but locks in St. Mary Mead are polite things. They yield to a bent hairpin and a lifetime of curiosity. Miss Marple let herself in at 2:30 on a steel bright afternoon when the constable on duty had gone to the Red Lion for a warming half-pint. The room smelled of cold ash and tragedy, the fire long dead, the blood on the carpet now a rusty map of continents. She moved like a small, determined ghost between the shrouded furniture, her sensible boots silent on the turkey rug. The desk had been tidied by some officious sergeant. Papers stacked, inkwell stoppered. The silver Bengal tiger letter opener laid precisely parallel to the blotter. Only the faint outline of Sir Giles' body remained, a ghost in negative space where the chair had been pushed back and never returned. Miss Marple opened the central drawer. Inside lay the household ledger, its pages still open to the morning of the murder. Sir Giles' handwriting, bold, impatient, the downstrokes thick as ship's cable, ended mid-sentence. "My dear Honoria, by the time you read this I shall have—" The sentence stopped in a violent spatter as though the pen had been hurled across the room, yet the nib was clean, the ink in the well congealed to a blackish plum. Miss Marple lifted the heavy cut-glass bottle to the window. The ink inside had frozen solid, its surface crazed with hairline fractures like a frozen pond. A perfect disk of ice floated atop the liquid that remained beneath, as neat as a coin. She set the bottle down and fetched her pocket lens, a modest affair with a mother-of-pearl handle, gift of her nephew Raymond many Christmases ago. Under magnification, the ice disk revealed a tiny golden speck, a flake of gold from the pen's nib trapped when the ink was deliberately chilled. "Ink does not freeze at English room temperature," she murmured. Someone wished this letter never to be finished. From her basket, she produced a candle stub and a box of Bryant and May. Lighting the candle, she held the flame beneath the bottle. The ice melted with a soft hiss. The ink beneath remained stubbornly thick. When at last it flowed, she dipped a fresh nib and completed the sentence in her own neat copperplate. "Done the only decent thing left to me." She stared at the words a long moment, then stoppered the bottle and returned it exactly as she had found it. Next, she turned to the French windows. The frost feathers on the inside sill had been photographed and scraped away by the police. But one pane still bore a palm print, small, delicate, the ridge pattern smudged by a glove of fine leather. Lady Honoria's hand, almost certainly, yet the print faced inward, as though someone had pressed against the glass from the terrace side, peering in. Miss Marple stepped outside. The snow here had been trampled to slush, but beneath the overhang of the eaves the cold was fierce. She looked up. The gutter directly above the window was lined with a neat row of icicles, each one identical in length to the murder weapon, 18 inches tapering to a needle. Someone had cleared the original crop and encouraged new ones to form. A garden syringe lay half buried in the drift below, its rubber bulb split by frost. Someone had been watering the gutter to hasten the freeze. She pocketed the syringe and was turning away when a voice behind her said, "Find what you were looking for, Miss Marple." Dr. Hayden Lloyd stood in the doorway, black bag in hand, snowflakes melting on his shoulders. His tone was courteous, but his eyes were wary. "I was admiring the icicles," she replied. "Such uniformity is rare in nature. Nature can be encouraged." He stepped onto the terrace, closing the door behind him. "The police surgeon asked me to collect Sir Giles's medical notes. Heart trouble, you know. Digitalis. They'll want to rule out natural causes." "Yet the heart was pierced," Miss Marple said gently. "Precisely." He opened his bag, revealing a folder of papers, and nestled beside them a slim glass vial half full of colorless liquid. "Distilled water," he said, anticipating her question. "For diluting morphine, quite harmless." He tipped the vial, slightly. The liquid caught the light like liquid crystal. Miss Marple noticed that the cork was stained faintly green. Verdigris, perhaps, or something else. "Curious," she said. "I once knew a nurse who kept distilled water in a vial exactly like that. She used it to freeze tiny surgical blades inside icicles for experimental purposes." Dr. Lloyd's smile did not reach his eyes. "One hears of such things in wartime. Desperate measures." "Indeed." She moved past him into the warmth of the library. Tell me, doctor, when you examined Sir Giles, did you happen to notice whether the wound had begun to clot before the icicle struck? He hesitated a fraction too long. Clotting takes minutes. Death was instantaneous. Yet the blood on the carpet was remarkably contained, almost as though it had been slowed by cold. Lloyd snapped his bag shut. You should leave detection to the professionals, Miss Marple. This is no knitting pattern. She regarded him mildly. Patterns are everywhere, doctor, even in frozen ink. He left without another word, his footsteps crisp on the terrace. Miss Marple waited until the sound died away, then reopened the desk drawer. Beneath the ledger lay a second sheet, half hidden, written in Sir Giles' hand but in pencil. The characters faint. If anything happens to me, ask Daphne why she was crying in the rose garden on the 3rd. And tell Roger the plantation shares are not his to gamble. The pencil had snapped mid-sentence, the broken stub lying beside it like a tiny exclamation mark. Miss Marple folded the note into her envelope beside the green wool and the syringe. 3 threads now. Frozen ink, cultivated icicles, and a secretary's tears. Outside, the new icicle directly above the window lengthened visibly, drip by deliberate drip. Someone was rehearsing. She closed the French windows, drew the curtains against the lengthening shadows, and left the library exactly as she had found it, except for one small alteration. On the blotter, she placed a single white camellia from the conservatory, its petals already bruised brown at the edges by frost. A warning or an invitation? Time would tell. Chapter 5. The alibi of the village hall clock. The village hall clock had been losing 7 minutes a day since the night the Home Guard dropped a mortar shell through the roof in 1943. Nobody had ever quite forgiven it, but nobody had ever quite fixed it either. It hung above the stage like a guilty conscience, its gilt hands frozen forever at 1/4 something or other. And its solemn tick echoed through the rafters where swallows nested in summer. Miss Marple arrived at 10:45 precisely, armed with a large cardboard box and the serene expression of a woman who has never been late for anything in her life. The hall was already filling with ex-servicemen in their regimental ties, ready for Captain Roger Blaine's monthly talk on life aboard a destroyer in the North Atlantic convoys. The trestle tables groaned under urns of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the air smelled of wet wool, pipe tobacco, and the particular brand of nostalgia that only old soldiers can brew. She took a seat in the back row, opened her box, and produced a perfect replica of the village hall clock. Cardboard face, black Roman numerals, hands fashioned from knitting needles painted gold. On the reverse, she had pasted a neat label. Property of St. Mary Mead. Women's Institute, do not touch Mr. Polk, the verger, who had been caught adjusting the real clock with a broom handle on 3 separate occasions. Flushed crimson and retreated to the tea urn. At 11 sharp, Captain Roger Blaine strode onto the stage, sunburnt and handsome in his blazer with the faded ribbon of the DSC. He began briskly, depth charges, U-boats, the time they rescued 23 Norwegians from a burning tanker. The old men leaned forward, eyes bright, remembering when their own hearts had beaten that fast. Miss Marple waited until the applause for the Norwegian rescue died away, then rose quietly and walked to the front. She placed her cardboard clock on the lectern directly beside Roger's notes. "Forgive the interruption, Captain," she said in her soft, lethal voice. "But the Women's Institute is raffling a clock tomorrow, and I promised Mrs. Bantry I would test the acoustics." "Do go on." Roger stared at the counterfeit timepiece as though it were a live grenade. The hands stood at 11:22. He recovered quickly. "Of course, Miss Marple. Time and tide, eh?" He tapped the real clock affectionately. "Though this old girl's been known to lie." Laughter rippled through the hall. The real clock showed 11:15. Miss Marple smiled and returned to her seat. At 11:30, Roger wound up to enthusiastic applause and stepped down. The moment his foot touched the floor, Miss Marple rose again. "Captain Blaine, you have been most generous with your time. Might I ask what o'clock your watch shows?" He glanced automatically at his wrist. 11:30 exactly. "And the hall clock?" 11:23, but as everyone knows, 7 minutes slow, she finished gently. "Yes. So when you arrived this morning, the hall clock read 11:08, did it not?" Roger's tan faded 2 shades. I really don't recall." "Memory is treacherous," Miss Marple agreed. "Fortunately, Mr. Finch at the post office sells stamps only between 11 and 11:30 on Wednesdays. He remembers you buying a 6-penny airmail quite distinctly at 11:20 by his clock, which is synchronized with Greenwich. That would make it 11:13 here." She turned to the audience, who were now watching with the rapt attention usually reserved for cup finals. 7 minutes, she said, is precisely the time it takes a fit man to run from this hall, across the green, through the postern gate, and reach the library terrace of Mead Manor. I know because I timed my nephew's boy last summer when he was training for the county cross-country. A collective intake of breath. Someone at the back whispered, "Good Lord." Roger found his voice. "Are you accusing me of murder, Miss Marple?" "Certainly not," she replied, shocked. "I am merely establishing that your alibi is as reliable as that clock. And now, gentlemen, I believe the tea is getting cold." She sat down amid a buzz that threatened to lift the roof. Roger Blaine stood rooted, the DSC ribbon suddenly looking very small against his blazer. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered to help stack chairs. When the hall was empty save for the swallows overhead, she climbed the rickety ladder to the clock face. The mechanism was simplicity itself. Weights, pendulum, a cracked escapement wheel. Someone had wedged a thin sliver of wood between the teeth to slow the swing. She removed it carefully with her nail scissors, wrapped it in tissue, and slipped it into the envelope that already held the green wool, the syringe, and Sir Giles's broken pencil. As she descended, the clock gave a startled cough and began to chime the correct time for the first time in 12 years. The sound rang out across the village, clear, triumphant, and more than a little accusing. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was the color of a pigeon's breast and the air smelled of thaw. Miss Marple paused on the steps to watch Roger Blaine stride away toward the Red Lion, shoulders hunched, hands thrust deep in his pockets. 7 minutes. 7 minutes to kill a man and return with salt spray still in your voice and the taste of the sea on your tongue. She shook her head sadly. Motive, opportunity, and now a cracked alibi. Yet something still did not fit. The icicle had been 18 inches long, far too long to conceal beneath a blazer. And the wound had been angled upward, as though delivered by someone shorter than Sir Giles. Roger was 6'1". Miss Marple tucked the envelope into her basket and set off for home. Behind her, the village hall clock struck 12, then 12:01, then 12:02, counting the seconds with the relentless precision of justice catching up. Chapter 6. The Green Wool Unravels. Mrs. Price's pantry at Mead Manor smelled of cloves, carbolic, and 43 years of unconfessed worry. It was a narrow room behind the kitchen, shelves crammed with silver polish, lavender bags, and ledgers bound in cracked morocco. A single gas mantle hissed above the table, throwing a hard circle of light onto the scrubbed deal surface where Miss Marple now laid the scrap of green wool as carefully as a surgeon placing a scalpel. Mrs. Price stood in the doorway, apron clutched in both hands, face the color of old parchment. "Sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said, pulling forward the only chair that did not have a pile of dusters on it. "We are quite private." Cook has gone to the village, Grimsby is polishing the boots, and Lady Honoria is resting with a migraine and a hot water bottle. No one will disturb us. Mrs. Price sat. The chair creaked like a confession. That wool is from the scarf Sir Giles gave me Christmas before last, she began without preamble. Real Shetland, soft as a baby's cheek. I wore it when I went out early on the morning of the icicle. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. You told me you fetched parsley at 5:30, yet the snow that covered the wool fell between midnight and 4. So you lost it earlier still. Mrs. Price's eyes filled. I couldn't sleep, not after what I'd seen the night before. At 11:20 I was crossing the landing with fresh linen when I heard voices from the library, Sir Giles and a woman, not her ladyship, younger. I knew the voice, Miss Daphne. They were quarreling something fierce. Then a crash like a chair going over, then silence. I crept to the top of the back stairs and waited. 10 minutes later, Miss Daphne came flying past me, face white as milk, scarf trailing. My green scarf. She'd snatched it from the hall stand because hers was soaked through. She never saw me. Out the side door she went into the snow. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. And you followed? I meant to. But when I got outside, she was already at the rose garden gate. She stopped under the library window, looked up, and laughed. A terrible sound, Miss Marple, like breaking glass. Then she tore the scarf from her neck, flung it into the roses, and ran toward the village. Mrs. Price pressed both hands to her mouth. Next morning, the scarf was gone from the bush, but that scrap must have stayed behind, caught fast. I never dared go back for it. Miss Marple opened her envelope and laid the wool beside a second, larger piece she had brought from home. The two matched perfectly. Same dye lot, same 8-ply twist, same tiny irregularity in the cable where Mrs. Price had dropped a stitch and picked it up again. So Miss Daphne wore your scarf at 11:20, she summarized gently. The time Captain Blaine claims to have been here in the village hall, and the exact time Dr. Lloyd estimates for death. Mrs. Price nodded, tears spilling now. I thought if I kept quiet, the police would blame the captain and leave the rest of us be. But it's eating me alive. Miss Marple patted her shoulder. Truth always comes out, Mrs. Price, usually with the help of a little green wool. She left the pantry deep in thought and made her way upstairs. The library was still sealed, but the yellow tape had been cut. Someone had been in. The camellia she had left on the blotter was gone. In its place lay a single violet forced in a hothouse, its stem wrapped in black ribbon. Daphne Mead's calling card. Miss Marple followed the scent of violets along the corridor to the secretary's room. A small chamber overlooking the stables, typewriter shrouded, desk tidy to the point of desperation. On the blotter lay an envelope addressed in Daphne's neat copperplate. Miss J. Marple. Inside was a single sheet. I know you have the wool. Meet me in the conservatory at 4. Come alone or the village will hear things no one should. DM. The conservatory at 4 o'clock was a jungle of steam and perfume. Palms dripped, grapes hung in purple clusters, and the glass roof dripped steadily into buckets placed beneath the leaks. Daphne stood beside the goldfish pond, coat unbuttoned, cheeks flushed from the heat. You've been busy, she said without greeting. Mrs. Price has been crying in the linen cupboard. Roger is drinking himself to death at the Red Lion. Even Dr. Lloyd looks as though he's seen a ghost. Leave it alone, Miss Marple. Some truths are kinder frozen. Miss Marple regarded the girl steadily. Truth is rarely kind, Miss Mead, but it is always cleaner than lies. Daphne laughed, a brittle sound. Cleaner? Sir Giles was going to dismiss me after 5 years. Said I was becoming emotional. Emotional. I loved him, you see, not the way a secretary should. He laughed at my letter, burned it in the grate while I watched. That night I came back, through the terrace. I had the scalpel I'd taken from Dr. Lloyd's bag weeks earlier. He'd never miss one. I meant only to frighten him, but he turned, saw the blade, and slipped on the rug, fell against me. The scalpel went in, just like that. Her voice cracked. There was so much blood, I pressed my scarf to the wound, Mrs. Price's scarf, to stop it. Then I saw the icicle above the window. I'd noticed it days before, perfect, long. I thought, if I could make it fall, cover the wound. I opened the window wider, reached up, twisted it free. It dropped straight through him a second time. I ran. Miss Marple's eyes never left the girl's face. And the frozen ink? The syringe in the gutter? Details, Daphne said wearily. I read detective stories. I thought if everything looked impossible, no one would believe it was murder. She reached into her pocket and drew out the missing camellia, brown and crumpled. I took this. Thought it was a message. Stupid. Miss Marple took the flower gently. It was a message, my dear, but not to you. Behind them, the conservatory door opened. Inspector Craddock stepped in, flanked by 2 constables. Daphne's shoulders sagged. You tricked me. No, Miss Marple said softly. You tricked yourself, the moment you tried to freeze the truth. As the handcuffs clicked, Daphne looked once more at the goldfish pond. The fish swam in lazy circles, orange and black, utterly indifferent. Mrs. Price met them in the hall, eyes swollen but calm. She pressed the completed green scarf into Daphne's hands. For the cold, she said simply, and for the first time in 43 years, Mrs. Price closed the front door of Mead Manor without locking it behind her. Chapter 7. The Second Icicle. The thaw began at 3 o'clock in the morning, a sly, treacherous softening that turned the snow crust to sugar and sent water trickling from every eave in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple lay awake, listening to the drip, drip, drip on her cottage roof like a guilty conscience counting seconds. At 3:20, she rose, wrapped herself in 2 cardigans and her old British warm, and slipped out into the moonlit lane with a torch, a pair of secateurs, and the calm of a woman who has decided the game must end tonight. Mead Manor loomed black against a sky rinsed clean of clouds. The police constable who should have been on duty was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple suspected warmth and a tot of something illegal in the lodge. She let herself through the postern and moved like a small, determined shadow along the terrace wall. The library eaves were alive with water. Icicles that had taken 2 days to grow now wept themselves to death, falling in silver shards that rang on the flagstones like broken bells. All except one. One icicle remained, 18 inches long, perfectly centered above the French window, thicker than any natural freeze could produce in a single night. It hung motionless, defiant, a sword of Damocles refrozen for a second performance. Miss Marple stepped beneath it and looked up. A length of fine fishing line glinted in her torch beam, tied to the gutter bracket and running downward inside the icicle itself. Someone had drilled a core, inserted the line, and sealed it with water that had frozen clear as glass. A gentle tug from within the library would bring the whole thing down at the chosen moment. She reached up with the secateurs and snipped the line. The icicle dropped neatly into her gloved hands, heavier than ice alone could account for. She laid it on the terrace table and shone the torch full upon it. Inside the frozen shaft, suspended like a fly in amber, was a slender steel scalpel, its blade no longer than a little finger handle wrapped in surgical tape. A second weapon ready to complete the illusion that nature had killed Sir Giles twice. Miss Marple wrapped the icicle in the scarf Mrs. Price had returned that afternoon. Soft green Shetland, now whole again, and carried it indoors through the baize door. The house was silent but not empty. She could feel watchful eyes in the darkness. She laid her burden on the kitchen table, fetched a pudding basin of hot water from the Rayburn and set the icicle to melt. While it wept, she made tea, strong, no sugar, and waited. Footsteps on the stairs, soft, stockinged, but unmistakable. Dr. Hayden Lloyd appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, dressing gown cord tied in a hasty knot. He stopped dead when he saw the scalpel lying naked on the table, water pooling around it like blood. "Dear me," Miss Marple said, pleasantly. "You are up late, Doctor." Lloyd's gaze flicked from the blade to her face. "I might say the same of you, Miss Marple. Breaking and entering is an offense, even for amateur detectives." "Curious," she replied, pouring tea into 2 cups, whether he wanted it or not. "I was about to say the same of rehearsing a murder." He sat down slowly as though his legs had decided for him. "You cannot possibly understand what you have found." "Oh, I understand a great deal." She pushed a cup toward him. "I understand that Sir Giles was dying anyway. Digitalis toxicity, slowly poisoning his heart. You were treating him, yes? But the dose was increasing, because someone was adding extra to his bedtime cocoa." Lloyd's hand jerked, tea slopped into the saucer. "Someone who had access to your bag," Miss Marple continued. "Someone who knew that if Sir Giles died naturally, the will would stand. Lady Honoria inheriting everything, including the plantation shares that Captain Blaine had been gambling away. But if he died by violence, the police would look for an outsider and the slow poison would never be noticed." She lifted the scalpel between thumb and forefinger. "You staged the perfect locked room murder. Daphne's scalpel for the first wound, small, almost surgical. Then the icicle to cover it, falling at the exact moment Lady Honoria conveniently discovered the body. But you needed a second icicle in case the first was examined too closely. Hence tonight's little rehearsal." Lloyd's voice was a whisper. "It would have been kinder, quick, painless. He was in agony." "Was he?" Miss Marple's eyes were winter blue and merciless. "Or was the agony yours, Doctor? Knowing that Honoria had promised you marriage once he was gone, knowing she would inherit everything, and you, nothing but a country practice and a conscience?" She opened her envelope and laid the contents in a row. Green wool, syringe, splinter from the village clock, the broken pencil, and now the second scalpel. "Honoria cultivated the icicles with water from the goldfish pond. Ammonia trace, very faint. You supplied the blades. Daphne provided the scandal to keep us distracted. Roger's broken alibi kept the police chasing shadows. Mrs. Price's silence protected 43 years of loyalty. Everyone played their part beautifully." Lloyd laughed then, a small broken sound. "And you, Miss Marple, what part do you play?" "The knitter who notices when the pattern goes wrong." She stood. "The constable is asleep in the lodge. I took the precaution of telephoning Inspector Craddock before I left my cottage. He will be here in 4 minutes." Lloyd looked at the scalpel, then at the door, then at the old woman who had beaten him with nothing more lethal than observation and a ball of wool. 4 minutes, he repeated. Time for one last house call. He reached for the scalpel. Miss Marple moved, faster than anyone would have thought possible. The heavy kitchen poker was in her hand and the doctor's wrist pinned to the table before the blade left its puddle. "No," she said gently. "There has been quite enough dying in this house." Headlights swept the terrace. Car doors slammed. Inspector Craddock's voice echoed down the corridor. In the sudden flood of light, Dr. Lloyd seemed to shrink, all the cleverness draining out of him like meltwater. Miss Marple released his wrist and laid the poker aside. Chapter 8. The clock strikes twice. The drawing room at Mead Manor had never looked so small. All the furniture had been pushed back against the walls, leaving a circle of turkey carpet like a stage lit by one lamp and the dying fire. Snow tapped the tall windows, urgent as Morse code, while the grandfather clock in the corner, Sir Giles's pride, a Tompion that had kept perfect time for 237 years, prepared to strike the half-hour. They were all there, arranged as carefully as chess pieces. Lady Honoria, regal in black velvet and the Harrington diamonds, occupied the sofa like a queen on a throne. Captain Roger Blaine stood behind her chair, one hand on the back rail, knuckles white. Dr. Hayden Lloyd sat opposite, wrists bandaged from the kitchen poker, eyes fixed on the carpet. Mrs. Price hovered by the door in her best bombazine, hands clasped so tightly the jet brooch trembled. Daphne Mead, pale as parchment, perched on a spindle-legged chair that looked too fragile to hold the weight of what she now carried. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, notebook closed for once. He had agreed to 10 minutes, no more. Miss Marple stood in the center of the circle, small and gray and utterly terrifying. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice soft enough that everyone leaned forward to hear, "we have been watching a play in 5 acts, each performer convinced they alone held the script. Tonight the curtain falls." She placed her basket on the occasional table and opened it with the solemnity of a conjurer revealing doves. Act 1. Motive. She laid the new will, ink still faintly blue, beside the old one. Sir Giles signed this on the 5th of January, leaving everything to Lady Honoria, but on the 8th he wrote a codicil revoking the bequest unless Honoria married Dr. Lloyd within 6 months of his death. He had discovered the affair. Honoria's diamonds flashed as she drew breath to protest. Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Act 2. Opportunity. The green wool, the syringe, the splinter from the village clock, the broken pencil, each item laid down like a playing card. Captain Blaine's 7 borrowed minutes, Mrs. Price's silence, Daphne's stolen scalpel, Dr. Lloyd's distilled water for freezing blades. Roger swore under his breath. Daphne began to cry silently. Act 3. The weapon. From the basket, Miss Marple produced the second icicle, now melted to a puddle in a pudding basin, the scalpel lying across it like a silver fish. A rehearsal for a second murder that never needed to happen, because the first had already succeeded. She turned to Dr. Lloyd. "You poisoned Sir Giles slowly, nightly in his bedtime cocoa. Digitalis, colorless, tasteless, cumulative. By the 10th of January, his heart was failing. All that remained was to make death look violent, sudden, impossible. An icicle through the heart would obscure the poison. A locked room would baffle the police." Lloyd's voice was a thread. He was in pain. "I swear it was mercy." "Mercy does not require an audience," Miss Marple replied. She moved to Lady Honoria. "You agreed to discover the body at 11:15 precisely, giving Roger his false alibi and Daphne her moment of panic. You watered the gutter to grow perfect icicles. You pressed Mrs. Price's scarf to the wound to slow bleeding until the second larger icicle could fall." Honoria's composure cracked like thin ice. "I did it for love." "Love," Miss Marple echoed, "is not a synonym for greed." She turned to Daphne. "You stabbed Sir Giles in passion at 11:10. You did not know he was already dying. When the icicle fell, guided by Honoria's fishing line, you thought Providence had covered your crime. You fled, leaving the scarf behind." Daphne's sob was the only sound. Act 4. Misdirection. Miss Marple lifted the cardboard clock from the village hall. Roger's broken alibi kept the police chasing a runner who never needed to run. Mrs. Price's loyalty kept her silent. Dr. Lloyd's medical authority certified instant death, hiding the poison. She faced them all now, small and inexorable. Act 5. The Truth. The Tompion clock began to chime, 8:30, clear and pure, each stroke a hammer on an anvil. At 11:04, Sir Giles was already unconscious from digitalis. At 11:08, Daphne entered distraught and struck once with the scalpel. At 11:10, Honoria, watching from the terrace, released the first icicle. At 11:15, she discovered the body. At 11:22, Roger arrived for his appointment, found chaos, and left again. 7 minutes that convicted an innocent man of murder he never committed. Silence, thick as wool. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. "Dr. Hayden Lloyd, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Giles Harrington by poisoning. Lady Honoria Harrington, you will be charged as accessory before and after the fact. Miss Daphne Mead, manslaughter. Captain Blaine and Mrs. Price, you are free to go, though I dare say the magistrates will want statements." Honoria rose, magnificent even in defeat. "You will never prove it." Miss Marple opened her hand. In the palm lay a single goldfish scale, iridescent, unmistakable. "The water in the gutter came from the conservatory pond," she said. "Ammonia traces, goldfish scale adhered. To the syringe nozzle. Forensic science is a wonderful thing, Lady Honoria. Rather like knitting. One dropped stitch and the whole garment unravels." The clock struck its final note. Dr. Lloyd stood without waiting for the constables. "It was meant to be kind," he said again, but no one was listening. As they were led away, Honoria between two policemen, Lloyd with his head high, Daphne weeping into Mrs. Price's green scarf, Miss Marple turned to the fire and dropped the cardboard clock into the flames. It curled, blackened, and was gone. Roger Blaine found his voice at last. I really thought I'd done it." "You did something far worse," Miss Marple said gently. "You lived as though you had." Mrs. Price closed the drawing-room door behind the police, then opened it again to let in the cold, clean night air. Snow had stopped falling. Somewhere a blackbird sang, absurdly early. Chapter 9. The Truth Thaws. They did not, after all, leave the drawing-room. Inspector Craddock had barely reached the door when the Tompion clock, faithful for 2 centuries, gave a small, apologetic cough and stopped dead at 29 minutes past 8. In the sudden hush, the only sound was the snow sliding from the eaves in soft, exhausted avalanches. Miss Marple lifted a hand. "One moment, Inspector. The play has 6 acts, not 5. The final performer has not yet taken the stage." She crossed to the windows, drew back the heavy brocade, and flung the French doors wide. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of thaw and something sharper. Violets, crushed and desperate. Daphne Mead stood on the terrace, coatless, bareheaded, hair plastered to her cheeks by melting snow. In her right hand she held the second scalpel, the one Miss Marple had believed safely locked in Craddock's evidence bag. Moonlight glittered along the blade like frost. "I took it from the kitchen table while you were all busy congratulating yourselves," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady, the voice of a woman who has stepped off a cliff and discovered she can fly. "It seemed only fair. One clean stroke for each of us." Roger Blaine started forward. "Daphne, for God's sake, stay where you are, Captain." She raised the scalpel. "You borrowed 7 minutes that never belonged to you. Honoria borrowed a husband. Dr. Lloyd borrowed mercy. Mrs. Price borrowed silence. I am simply returning what was stolen." Mrs. Price gave a small broken cry and sank into a chair. Daphne stepped into the room. Water dripped from her skirt, pooling dark on the carpet. "You thought you had it all sewn up, Miss Marple. The perfect village solution, everyone guilty, everyone forgiven, tea and crumpets tomorrow. But you forgot one thing." She turned the blade so the light ran along it like liquid silver. "Sir Giles was already dead when I stabbed him. Dead for 6 minutes, to be precise." Dr. Lloyd's digitalis had done its work. I killed a corpse. That makes me guilty of what? Desecration theater? Lloyd made a strangled sound. Honoria's diamonds flashed as she pressed both hands to her mouth. Daphne smiled, a terrible, luminous smile. So I decided to finish the performance properly. She raised the scalpel, not toward anyone else, but toward her own throat. Miss Marple moved. No one saw quite how it happened. One moment she was by the fireplace. The next she had Daphne's wrist locked in a grip that belonged to a woman who had once disarmed a poacher with a crochet hook. The scalpel clattered to the parquet. "Enough," Miss Marple said, and for the first time her voice cracked like a whip. "There has been quite enough dying in this house." Daphne struggled, wild as a trapped bird, but the old woman held her as gently, as fiercely as a mother holding a fevered child. "Listen to me," Miss Marple whispered into the girl's ear, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Sir Giles kept a second ledger, hidden behind the false back of the desk. In it he wrote that he knew about the poison, that he had increased the dose himself every night for a week. He wanted to die before the pain became unbearable, before he became a burden. He left letters, for you, for Honoria, for Dr. Lloyd, forgiving you all, begging you to let him go. She released Daphne's wrist and reached into her basket. Out came a slim Morocco-bound book and 3 sealed envelopes. He wrote them the night before, addressed them himself. Then he sat at his desk and waited for the end. When you came, Daphne, he was already gone. The icicle was his idea, his last joke on the world. He had loosened it himself at dawn, knowing the thaw would bring it down at 11:15 precisely. She laid the ledger on the table. The final entry in Sir Giles's shaking hand read, "If they tear themselves apart looking for a murderer, let them. The only crime was keeping me alive too long. Forgive them, Jane. They meant it for love." Miss Marple looked round the circle of stricken faces. "He knew you all better than you knew yourselves. Honoria, he knew you loved the idea of him more than the man. Doctor, he knew you could not bear to watch suffering. Daphne, he knew your love had turned to hatred because he could not return it. Roger, he knew you would blame yourself most of all." She opened the envelopes one by one. To Honoria, "Burn the will. The money is cursed. Give it to the village hospital and be free." To Dr. Lloyd, "Mercy is not yours to give. Resign your practice. Go to Africa. Heal the living." To Daphne, "You stabbed a ghost child. Marry someone kind, have babies, forget me." Silence, deeper than any snowfall. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "Then, there was no murder?" "There was a conspiracy of kindness," Miss Marple said softly, "and a conspiracy of guilt, both lethal in their way." She turned to Daphne, who was weeping now in great tearing sobs that shook her whole body. "Come, my dear, Mrs. Price will make cocoa, real cocoa with milk and sugar and no digitalis at all." Honoria stood, diamonds suddenly garish against her pallor. "The will be burned tomorrow," Miss Marple finished, "along with every other lie we told ourselves." She looked at the stopped clock. Time to start again. As if in answer, the Tompion gave a small mechanical sigh and began to tick once more. Slow, steady, forgiving. Outside, the thaw quickened. Water roared in the gutters, carrying away the last of the winter's cruelty. Somewhere in the village, a church bell rang 9 clear strokes, and the blackbird answered from the yew tree. Chapter 10. Tea and Understanding. The morning after the night everything melted, Mead Manor woke to the smell of frying bacon and the sound of water pouring from every pipe like a village orchestra tuning up. The snow had vanished so completely that only the soggy lawns and the occasional drowned snowdrop remembered it had ever existed. Sunlight, thin but honest, poured through the breakfast-room windows and turned the silver teapot into a small sun of its own. Miss Marple sat at the head of the table, a position no one disputed anymore, presiding over a breakfast that Mrs. Price had cooked as though feeding the 5,000. Bacon, eggs, sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes, kippers, kedgeree, deviled kidneys, and an entire battalion of toast marched across the white cloth. The Tompion clock, newly regulated by a grateful Craddock, struck 9 with the polite cough of a butler announcing royalty. Lady Honoria came down first, wearing a dove-gray morning dress and no diamonds at all. Her face was bare of powder. She looked 10 years younger and 100 years tired. "Jane," she said simply, "I have telephoned the hospital. The entire estate will be signed over this afternoon, Sir Giles's last wish." Miss Marple poured tea. "He would approve. Milk?" Honoria managed a watery smile. "1 sugar. I appear to have mislaid my taste for ostentation." Dr. Lloyd followed, carrying his black bag for the last time. He laid a letter on the tablecloth beside Miss Marple's plate. "My resignation, effective immediately. Passage to Mombasa booked on the Union Castle. There is a mission hospital short of hands and long on fever." He hesitated, then added, "I shall never forgive myself, but I may perhaps forgive the man who tried to be God." Miss Marple pressed his hand. "Go with a clear conscience, Hayden. The sick do not care who held the lancet, only that it is steady." Captain Roger Blaine appeared next, shaved, sober, and wearing the same blazer but with the ribbon snipped off. He placed a check beside the teapot. £23,000, everything I borrowed against expectations. The plantations are yours, Honoria, yours and the hospitals. I sail for Canada on Friday. Timber, not tea, honest work." He looked at Miss Marple with something close to awe. "I thought I was a killer for 2 days. Turns out I was only a fool. Better wages in foolishness, apparently." Mrs. Price bustled in with a fresh pot, and behind her Daphne Mead, hair brushed, eyes still swollen but dressed in a neat navy coat and skirt that Mrs. Price had pressed at dawn. "I'm catching the 10:15 to London," Daphne said, voice husky. "Secretarial college, proper qualifications this time. No more typing love letters to married men." She laid a small parcel on the table. Inside was the green Shetland scarf, washed, reknitted. "Perfect. For you, Mrs. Price, to say thank you for 43 years and for 1 night of cocoa without poison." Mrs. Price burst into tears and hugged the girl so hard the toast rack leapt an inch into the air. Inspector Craddock arrived last, helmet under arm, looking as though he had slept in a hedge. Coroner's verdict. Death by misadventure aggravated by misplaced affection. Case closed. He accepted a cup of tea and 3 sausages. "Though between ourselves, Miss Marple, I shall dream of goldfish scales for the rest of my career." Miss Marple buttered a 4th piece of toast and spread it thickly with marmalade. "Now," she said, "we may all begin again. The hospital will have a new wing. Dr. Lloyd will have redemption. Captain Blaine will have calluses. Lady Honoria will have simplicity. Daphne will have a future. And Mrs. Price." Mrs. Price straightened, apron starched to attention. "Mrs. Price will have a cottage of her own in the village, rent-free courtesy of the new hospital trustees, and a pension that will keep her in Shetland wool until she is 90. Mrs. Price sat down hard on the nearest chair and wept into the kedgeree. Outside, the postman cycled up the drive, whistling Green Sleeves. Children ran past the windows shouting about puddles deep enough to sail boats in. A blackbird sang from the roof of the conservatory as though the world had never known winter. Miss Marple raised her cup. "To Sir Giles," she said quietly, "who loved us all badly but loved us all the same." They drank. The tea was hot, strong, and tasted faintly of forgiveness. When the meal was over, Miss Marple walked alone to the library. The room had been stripped of police tape. Sunlight lay across the desk in clean, democratic bars. She opened the French windows and stepped onto the terrace. The eaves were bare. The gutter had been cleared. Only a single goldfish scale remained, stuck to the stone by a drop of water that caught the sun and flashed like a tiny star. She flicked it gently into the flower bed. "Sleep well, old friend," she said to the empty air. "Your last joke was on all of us, and the kindest one you ever played." Behind her, the breakfast party spilled out onto the terrace, laughing, arguing about who would drive Mrs. Price to the solicitor, who would carry Daphne's suitcase to the station. Ordinary, noisy, wonderful life. Miss Marple took her place among them, small and gray and indispensable, like the comma in a very long sentence that had finally decided to make sense. The church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere a train whistled for London. A boy shouted that the pond was perfect for rafting. Spring, it seemed, had arrived 6 weeks early in St. Mary Mead. And Miss Jane Marple, who had seen every kind of villainy a quiet village could hide, walked back into the sunlight with the calm of a woman who knows that some mysteries are solved simply by letting the snow melt